Welcome back to the podcast. Real quick before today's episode, we got Mike Creavey on the show today talking about the Shroud of Turin. Great show. Actually, he released it last week on his channel. Check it out, Mike Creavey. Also, The Gracious Guest is the name of his podcast. He's not an expert, he says, but he gives some really good points and something that maybe you never thought of about the Shroud before. My favorite thing was probably the travel of the Shroud, at least what we know of it. Award warning, this is over an hour, so if you're driving to work, maybe this is a couple days of drive time for you. If you're sitting down on the couch, get cozy because this is going to be a very good episode. Also, I want to throw this out there. Maybe this would make a good family night. You put up on the TV and you watch it because there's a PowerPoint in this. So make sure if you can watch the video link, you can watch it on Spotify, YouTube, and Facebook. You can get, of course, the audio record version pretty much anywhere, but YouTube, Facebook, and Spotify have the video as well. So make this a family kind of movie morning night, Watch the presentation by Mike. It's well put together. Also, maybe get some people from church and, at church or at someone's house, at your house, have a little community gathering on it as well. So again, Mike Creavey, high school teacher, both online and in person. So really check it out and hoping you enjoy today's show. So without further ado, here is a very well-rounded, a little over an hour episode of course, what a lot of people are hungry for, the Shroud of Turin.
Welcome to the Catholic Table Talk podcast. This is where everything Catholic is on the table. New episodes Thursdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on most podcast platforms. Here's your host, William Sauber.
Thank you again for joining us here at Catholic Table Talk podcast for episode 197. Don't forget, episode 200 is coming up in a few short weeks, so be on the lookout for that. Also, I want to give a big shout out to all of our partners. If you want to learn more about our partners, go to our website, CatholicTableTalk.com. Click on the partner tab, and you can see all the partners that we have partnered with. So go support them if you can, and at least go check them out. So again, CatholicTableTalk.com. Hit the partner tab to find all of our partners, and thank you for our partners. Just been really helpful with keeping the podcast going, and just really very gracious with their time and donations. So today we're kind of doing things a little bit different. We kind of did something like this before. We're giving a presentation, and this is a very, very big thing we're going to talk about today is the Shroud of Turin. Now, back where I am, there was a presentation on it in a big theater. It was 1,200 people, and that thing sold out pretty dang fast. So it's a big thing when it comes to Christianity. It's a big thing outside of Christianity. A lot of people want to know more about it. And if you ever doubt your faith, which let's admit it, most of us probably have at some point in our life, the Shroud of Turin, at least for me, is kind of it's that reinforcer of faith of like, this is actually, yes, quite true. I actually do believe in something true. So, but what are the discoveries of it? Well, why is it called the Shroud of Turin? What are the pictures on it more in detail look like? And we have a very gracious guest. He's actually the host of the Gracious Guest podcast, Mike Creavey, and he's a high school history teacher, and he's been on a few episodes. And this is pretty much a class by itself, so that I know he has to feed his family, but he's pretty much doing this for free for us. So a big shout out to Mike for doing that. So Mike, thank you again for being on the show, and thank you for just, inviting us to learn more about the Shroud, because, like I said, it's a very big topic in and out of Christianity.
Absolutely. Well, William, it's a real pleasure to be back on here and It's it is. I think it's a really amazing topic that and not to give a whole long big backstory here, but one thing that I just find interesting about all this is I never set out to have this be like a recurring topic of interest for myself by any means. I basically learned some really cool details. I put what uh, was sort of the I don't know, like version one of this some of these slides I'm going to share with everybody here today together to use in a class a couple years ago. And in my high school theology class, mostly for freshmen, and it was around Holy Week, and I just thought like this is a neat way to meditate on the Passion of Jesus, and it kind of was almost it seemed like an accident. I went and put it on YouTube because I was just like that was a really cool class, and they were really interested, and that just took off. I mean, I think I had a maybe about 100 or 150 subscribers back then, and ever since I did that, it just went nuts, and have been blessed to make a lot of friends in the Shroud world, and now I feel some level of responsibility to make sure I'm doing the best I can with this and trying to bring folks onto my channel pretty regularly. So little maybe shameless self promotion, but I encourage anything we talk about today. If any of your audience wants to learn more about it, I just checked earlier. I think I'm up to over 40 different Shroud videos. Almost all of them are interviews on my YouTube channel, and I didn't even know it was that many. So
Wow,
there's
that's cool.
a lot and different topics and aspects. Everything we'll look at today and more in much more depth, basically. So I'm just
Sure.
giving an overview today. I'm not the expert.
Okay. Well, more an expert than me, but yeah. So really good, and congrats on 40 episodes or over 40. That's quite the achievement. I mean, especially if
Yeah,
something that what it's setting out to do. So
yeah,
that's truly calling. So yeah, well, let's just kind of dive right into it, Mike. I mean,
sure.
it's the Shroud to Win. I think a lot of people have heard about it. A lot of people probably
Yeah.
seen it and watch other stuff on it. But just I mean, let's hit a hard in the presentation.
Yes, no, my pleasure. And this is, uh, I start off with just this disclaimer. As I said, I go down the list here. Here's all the things I am not, okay, in terms of
Gotcha.
expertise. I have a lot of interests. As I said earlier, I'm a high school theology teacher. I uh, have actually a background in history. Was my first sort of love academically, and that grew into theology. And I do this YouTube work. Of course, I had this interest in communication and media, and basically, as I go down the list, all these things that are very important to me personally, my own background, my own interests, which kind of led to that last bullet, right?
Sure.
That I've just, in God's grace, come into contact with folks who are all of these things over on the left side of your screen there. And what's fascinating is all of these folks have their own. They bring again their own expertise, their own interest into the study of the shroud, and I think it sheds different light, right? It sheds different light on different aspects of it. But just to sort of set the stage here, what I labeled curiosities. First of all, where Turin is, and you had asked me beforehand about a little bit of the background, and I'm not an expert per se on the history of Turin itself. It's a very very old city. It's otherwise known as Torino. You see it up there in northwestern Italy, close to the Swiss and French borders. In fact, here's a beautiful picture of it I just got on Google, and you can see the Alps there in the distance. This was
Awesome.
the hometown of people like Blessed at the time of this recording, soon to be Saint, thank God, Pier Giorgio Frassati. Those mountains he loved to climb so much are right there. And this where Saint John Bosco, was active as well. So there's and many other saints, I believe St. Charles Borromeo. I think, in fact, one of the reasons that the shroud is in Turin and has stayed there for the last few hundred years, it wasn't known as the Shroud of Turin until it became, custom. The custom became that it was housed in Turin in the sort of holdings and treasury of the Savoy family, which was the ruling family of Italy for many many generations, and they ceased their custody of the shroud only as recently as 1983, I think, where they
Oh,
bequeathed it to Pope John Paul II with a special provision that it be basically the property or in the stewardship of the Holy Father now indefinitely. So whoever the Pope is the one who's got custody of the shroud, but they keep it in Turin, and with its special, protective case and provisions being taken to preserve it and all those kinds of things. Since there's a team there dedicated to that, the typical custom has been it's the Pope's to take care of, but he entrusts it to the folks in Turin. And so in the cathedral, and by the way, anytime, Billy, you stop me. Anytime you want any questions. So the cathedral there of St. John the Baptist, which I would love to visit someday, haven't been there myself. And then inside that, I believe bulletproof, I don't know how proof it is, if it's bomb proof or what it is, but a very secure chapel on the side there. If you can kind of see, can you see my mouse going around there?
I can.
Or not? Okay, that's good. So that is we'll see it later, a zoom in of the face, the facial image that everybody's probably familiar with. We'll see later. That's always visible. That's just a facsimile. Inside this case here is the actual shroud, and it's a hyper sophisticated, modern, argon gas filled container that now protects the cloth, and so that's where it's normally kept, unless it's brought out in a special display case where you can see the whole thing. And that only happens every couple years when the Holy Father permits that. I think the last time was 2020, I want to say. So okay. I don't know when the next one will be, but I'm sure we'll hear about it.
I'm sure.
So, bottom line, okay, well, that's where it is. What do we, very basic sketch here, what is this? Because we assume people have heard of this, but maybe folks watching are like, I think I know, but I'm not sure. Here's just some basics. It's a linen cloth, first of all, that's been very much damaged by water stains and fires. It's survived. Like, it's an old cloth. It's been through a lot. So if you see on the right here, we'll get to the image of the man on it in a second, but it's first things first, it's a linen cloth. A little over 14 feet by a little over 3 feet wide. That I'll show later kind of how we imagine it covering the body. It's kept in Turin. It's been there since 1578. Before that, we have several hundred years of history back to France I'll talk about later. And then there's a lot of question marks before about 1356. And that's where a lot of folks who criticize it or say that it's a hoax or that it's not authentic would say, well, the earliest records we have of it, historical documents, only go back to 1350 something. That's about when it was made. And there's evidence to support that, but we'll see there's some problems with that too. It bears the mysterious image front and back of a man laid out in death who's been flogged and crucified, as we'll see later on in, I would go so far as to say, perfect conjunction with the descriptions of Jesus' sufferings we see in the Gospels. Which has led many to believe for a very long time that this is literally the cloth Jesus was buried in by Joseph of Arimathea we read about in the Gospels, and through which he resurrected, whatever that was, right?
Right.
That's the amazing claim, right? Now in 1988, there was this carbon dating we'll talk a little bit about later, which made headlines all over the world. Basically, it was saying, "Oh, look, busted! It's not authentic. It's a hoax." The hyper sophisticated, very well funded, very well advertised and promoted, and globally covered carbon dating of the shroud, long anticipated carbon dating, says it's from the basically 1200s or 1300s. It's a hoax. But as you see there, new evidence, we'll come back to that, increasingly, since 1988, and more so in just the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's always more information coming out, suggests there's some problems with that dating, okay? And last but not least, when you actually study the cloth, and a lot of the data that's been gathered on the cloth before and after the carbon dating in 1988, there's some really interesting and sometimes weird, sometimes the hair goes up on the back of my neck, details that are really cool to look at. So that's what we want to do today.
Okay. Awesome.
So, should I keep going? We good?
We're good for now. I know you're going to do a lot more, like you said.
Well, and that's the thing. Like I said, like this slide, for example, you could do like whole shows just on this. So the bottom line is, the shroud. It first really got interest in modern times when an Italian photographer named Secondo Pio in the year 1898 did the first photographs of it, and when he processed the film, he basically freaked out because what he discovered for the first time ever, is, again, we'll see later, that face was the level of detail, the hyper high resolution, hyper detailed aspects that came through in the processing of that film showed stuff that the naked eye had never seen before, information from within the image itself that could only be detected in more modern times. And that absolutely, people called him a hoaxer. They criticized him. He faced a lot of scrutiny for that. And then later, a few decades, later it was photographed again, same phenomenon. And so that generated a lot of interest in the more modern kind of scientific era, especially the 20th century, of a lot of interest in the Shroud, people studying the Shroud, and that really culminated and built up to this study done in 1978, this team of researchers representing multiple organizations and labs across the US, primarily, and these are like Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA, Los Alamos, all these very serious, some military contractors, like all these people bringing all of the space age technology. And they went over there after preparing all of the criteria they were going to investigate. And these are photographers, biologists, astrophysicists, chemists, like people representing a lot of different fields. The goal they had was, they said, we're going to go over there, and it took a lot to get this access. I mean, this was never before. I mean, all the regulations they had to follow with the Savoy family. It was in the palace there. So this was a really, really stressful thing. They only had a few days, and they worked round the clock, this whole team, and studying everything, taking sticky tape samples, gathering data that we're still unpacking to this day. Right? No one's had this access since then.
Gotcha.
And in fact, sadly, and just scandalously, perhaps, I think in 2002, a restoration kind of team, or a crew trying to preserve the cloth, basically vacuumed the cloth. Right, so there's things that were on the cloth. Thank God we have this, all this data, because if you went to do it now, you wouldn't find some of that, unfortunately. So it's been lost, but we have it, thankfully, from their studies that we can continue to investigate. Anyway, long story short, they did all these samples. They went back, and then they proceeded to study and dig into all that data for many, many years after 1978. And so a lot of the really cool findings we'll talk about were first discovered with the STURP team, or the Shroud of Turin Research Project. A lot of the guys on this team who are often, a claim you'll hear a lot online is these are a bunch of religious fanatics who wanted to go prove the ridiculous claim, and absolutely astonishingly debunked over and over again. Yes, there were some believers, but nobody, I've never met or heard of any of them who were, anything other than a consummate scientific, professional who was there to study it. Many of them were atheists or agnostics. There were several Jews, like a couple Jews on the team, like people who were basically Barry Schwartz of happy memory, who just died, the official photographer. Barry probably did more for the Shroud than anybody in the years after this. He ran shroud.com, which is a great website, and got the links below. I'll make sure to share with you. But Barry, I think to his dying day, I don't think he became Christian. I don't think he wasn't convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, but he was thoroughly convinced that the man on the shroud was Jesus.
Okay.
And I think, if I remember correctly, that he affirmed that Jesus rose from the dead. I don't know, he had a different idea maybe of what that meant, but and someone will, I'm sure, correct me if you have the comments open. I'm sure we'll see the comments thread later. Anyway, so this was a huge study that was done, and a lot of the information came out of that. One thing I like to point out here that's fun, Billy, is the, we talk about evidence. So a lot of people like to bring up the counterclaims, or they say, oh, it's a fake, here's how they did it. And you'll see all these claims. One thing I've noticed is there will be people who, when I post a video, they'll list tremendously complex, like long, sometimes people just say, it's not real, it's, it was disproved, and then they move on. I'm like, all right, well, clearly you didn't watch the whole hour of this person making these arguments about why that 88 carbon dating is wrong. So I don't really pay a lot of attention to those. But someone will give a really long, very detailed rebuke. But when you really break it down, they're focusing on one thing usually, maybe two, and they're trying to make a counterclaim for what made the image, or how to explain the blood, or that. But the thing a lot of people forget is you have to look at just the sheer preponderance of evidence, all the different claims in so many different areas. And that's the kind of thing that really has me convinced. Any one particular detail, if that, fell out, or if it was disproven or something, that wouldn't completely throw me off. I really do. I feel like I'm convinced because of just the sheer volume of fascinating details that to me don't have any more reasonable explanation. So just one, for example, this is not going to make or break it, but this is a fun detail. Let me quiz you real quick. So if you look at the proportions on the shroud, and I show this to my students a lot, it's 14 feet 3 inches by 3 feet 7 inches. And if you're like me, you look at that and you're like, that's random. Like, why is it that? And you think about it like, well, if you ask you or me or, like, hey, go measure that piece of cloth, we're going to measure it with a ruler, right? Maybe a yardstick, but probably a ruler, inches, feet. But Jews of Jesus's time, for example, didn't use rulers. And so this is pretty cool. Do you remember a little biblical trivia here? What unit of measurement they tended to use in the Old Testament, for example, for things like the ark? You happen to remember?
No, I know off the top of my head, I can't.
I shouldn't have. That's mean. I just put him on the spot, everybody.
No, it's totally fine.
Well, the cubit, right? You're like Noah builds the ark by so many cubits. Well, interestingly, the shroud is 8 cubits by 2 cubits.
Really?
Which doesn't prove, like, oh, it's Jesus's. Well, no, hold on. It doesn't even prove it's a Jewish cloth. But my only point with this kind of thing is, wouldn't you expect it to be in cubits if it was actually an authentic Jewish burial cloth? Like, that's the kind of thing that makes me go, oh, that's interesting. That's more likely. So there's little things like that. I think no piece of evidence is too small or too big, like, to take into consideration. This is how you have to imagine. So if this is the cloth, and you can see again, look at how faint that is. Like, you could barely even notice. Here's his face, right? And then like chest and arms and legs, but it's very, very faint, right? Like this ghostly, kind of image. And then here's the back of the head. You might not even notice unless I specifically line it out. Here's the back. And here's, the bottom, and then the legs and the bottom of the feet. So you have to imagine, essentially, the claim is, so Jesus is buried, or he's taken off the cross, and they lay him in the shroud like this. They move him to the tomb, which is not far away, prepare his body hastily for burial because the Sabbath is coming up just a few hours later. They get him in the tomb, and ostensibly they're going to come back and do a more thorough preparation of the body later. That's what it even says in the Gospels, right? The women show up early on the first day they can, right? Sabbath is Saturday. You can't get to him then. Since Saturday night, when Sabbath is over, you can't really do anything with that. So let's show up first thing in the morning on Sunday, right? To them, it's the first day of the week, even on our calendar, right? So we'll go back, and he's not there. And they're like, oh, okay. So that's the theory is, here he is, he's wrapped in the shroud, and he resurrects out of the shroud. And whatever that was, we believe, those who think it's authentic, the claim is that's what made that image on the cloth.
Because if I may, Mike,
yes, please, yeah.
We also get like Jesus' image on the Veronica when she wipes the face of Jesus when he's carrying the cross. Mm-hmm. So, if that is go ahead.
And there's a whole interesting thing with that too. That might be. Because the Veronica incident, it's not in scripture specifically, but we have it retained, of course, in tradition, and most especially in the Stations of the Cross. Right. And but what's neat is there's this, I never knew about this like a year ago, that there's this debate about her name. Like, the name Veronica seems to etymologically mean true icon or true image.
Okay.
And that it's possible that the origin of that story might be the shroud itself. And then it's this early reference to this true image of Jesus, and that over time it's separated into a different tradition of this cloth that had his face on it with maybe the blood or something like that. And there's different relics purporting to be that. But this is my point of, like, all these other tributaries, these other potentially cool things to follow. I'll also throw out for the heck of it, there's also a really interesting argument to be made that the shroud, if it is authentic, might be the origin of the Holy Grail story. I've got a whole video on that too with Justin Robinson, who's a coin expert in Great Britain, who came on to talk about some things I'll get to here later as well. And Justin makes a pretty good case that it starts as this, it's a vessel, right? That only later traditions, I think, as he said, that you start to see it described as a cup, but he said it's vessel. Vessel means something that carries something or that bears something. And what would, he goes, what would make the most sense of the thing that was there around the time of the crucifixion to be the vessel that carries the blood of Jesus? He's like, how about the burial cloth? And I'm like, dude, that is crazy, And so, and there's other related theories. There's supposedly a place where then the shroud was kept for a while that then gets confused with the name of like this, I think this town in Britain, and then it becomes the theory of it going to Britain. But anyway, that's a whole other fun side subject as well.
Sure.
But let me show you this here because this is pretty cool. A zoom in here, front of the body, back of the body, front of the body. But here's where it gets really cool because when you, like I said, when you start doing the photo negative.
Right.
Like, do you see, like, I love this, like, where you can actually see the jump to, like, how much more resolution you see in that. And the thing I
Much
want
more.
everyone to understand here, this isn't like photographic trickery. Nothing's been done to this except making that, which you see with the naked eye, into a photo negative of it. In fact, I just had someone on a previous video I did where I was interviewing, I forget who I was interviewing off the top of my head, but a gentleman in the comments said, Mike, he goes, you have to do this with your class. Go to your iPhone settings. And he gives me like this. I'm always suspicious, like, is this a bot? But he said, no, do this. And I switched under accessibility on my iPhone where you can switch it to like photo negative and hold your phone up to my replica of the shroud in my classroom that looks like this. And if you just hold the photo negative up, this is what you see.
Seriously.
It's absolutely crazy. Yeah. And so, in other words, this resolution, the detail we get here that we're going to unpack, that is, I just want to be clear to everybody, all of that data that you're seeing right now, that your eyes are interpreting, is in this image. In what is physically on the piece of linen cloth. And it was always there. Like, as old as this is, it's always been there. That's the biggest mystery. How in the world can this image possibly exist on a piece of non-photographically sensitive material? And that's what the STURB team was like, we're going to figure it out. We're space age people. They went there, they studied it meticulously like no one ever has before or since, and they come away basically saying, all we can say is what it's not. And we'll get to that later. Like, here's what didn't make the image. We have no idea what did. And now the cool thing is we have a better idea recently of possibly what might have led to the phenomena, and that's even more mysterious because it's like, oh, well, we have a better idea. Yeah, but it's even more weird now. So more on that in a minute here. So so a couple cool things. Now, this next image, I don't want to freak anybody out. These are, I just want to be clear, these are not blood stains specifically, not every one of them. This has been doctored up. Just someone on Google did this just to kind of highlight. They could have used green or blue or whatever. So wherever you see red, some of it are blood stains. So there are definitely blood stains here on the hands, on the side, on the feet. Some of these are open wounds. A lot of them, though, are welts or abrasions or really nasty scourge marks, right? Where it's which, to be fair, not to make light of that, because it's been pointed out, like the violence level of the scourging scene in the Passion of the Christ, for example, is probably exaggerated because he would have died within minutes. But not to downplay the suffering of our Lord. I heard one doctor saying that these kinds of scourge wounds, and this many of them, he said every one of them would be as painful as a 3rd-degree burn.
Ooh.
And I just like, I just, like sometimes I tear up when I give this because if you think about Jesus, the fact is, I want to keep repeating this, whoever this is went through exactly what Jesus did. Like, that's the point I want to get across to everybody. This is an exact representation down to every little detail of precisely what Jesus went through, including, and this is a neat thing, like historians have shown with a real replica flagrum, like a Roman whip specifically, because, different countries through different times have different methods of corporal punishment. A specific Roman flagrum, which ask yourself, okay, if this is a 14th century French hoax, where did they get a real Roman flagrum?
Right.
It's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
But we, like with the more archaeological age in recent centuries, like we've rediscovered some of these, and they've shown how like you can line those little barbells up and it matches perfectly every one of those whip wounds. They've even done computer simulations. This is the level of research on this. It's crazy. They've proven that this man was whipped by 2 different guys on either side of him, behind him, like in the Passion, and one of them was taller than the other by quite a bit because they can get the arc of the whip motion. They can figure that out by studying the direction of the hit. That's the level of study that's been, I mean, it's wild. And so I keep saying this is a lot, but there's so much more than you guys will even get in this. I'm just giving you the overview. So there's all these scourge marks, front and back. There's on his head, we see the evidence of a crown of thorns more like this, all these puncture wounds on the scalp. If you've ever had a head wound of any kind, you know how painful that can be and how much it
Oh yeah.
bleeds. And so all these details are just really fascinating. And one of the ones I think is most fascinating is the again, this is a big blood stain right here. I'll say more about it later, so remember this. But if anyone's wondering too, it's like, oh, that's on his left side. It's what you have to understand is whatever the image is, it shoots off his body and imparts that on the cloth, like mirror image, right? So this is not like if you're looking at him, this you have to flip it in your mind. So that is his right side, which we see that on crucifixes too, like all these details. But that, yeah, keep that side wound in mind, and remember, of course, in the Gospels, it specifically talks about the guard, checking to see if he was dead because he died faster than most crucifixion victims normally died, which again is more evidence within Scripture that he had been especially maltreated. Usually this could last days or even like a week or so sometimes. It was a horrible way to die very slowly and painfully. So he tests him by stabbing him. It says he didn't break his bones. None of the man's bones are broken. Sometimes people, come back and they're like, oh, it's not Jesus because this guy's nose is broken. Well, it's cartilage, perhaps. Like, it depends on how, how sola scriptura you want to get, right? With like, it's like, so you have to look at all of the data, I feel like. So here, yeah, let me pause quick. I'm going on and on. Do you have any questions on that, or because I think you wanted to talk about the journey too, right?
Yeah, a little bit, Tim. I know we'll get to that in a little bit. But just going back to and I've been thinking about this as you keep talking, and I think this kind of ties back into everything that we learned so far about it, Mike, is that when they were doing the research back in 1978, I mean, a lot of people, like you said, it was only a few days that they had time, and they've been doing research ever since.
Yeah.
But what would you say as, I mean, again, like you say, you're not an expert, but what would you say if someone would say, well, they only had a few days, they still made stuff up? Everything that you've told us, showed us so far with the wounds, everything. I mean, again, it seems very clear logic. I mean, like you said, college maybe. But what would you say if someone was like, they had a few days, they made it up? It's more,
right. Or that they were hasty, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a good question too. I would just say, go check it out for yourself, because all of everything they did, is documented. It's available. Shroud.com, again, has decades and decades. I mean, I think when Barry Schwartz launched that website in the mid 90s, he had almost 20 years to kind of gather everything. He had this huge network, and basically just Shroud.com's it's not the most user-friendly website sometimes because it's just this huge info dump, but you've got all these links on there to, the original studies, all the background on who was involved in the team, what they went through, what all the protocols that they followed were, where they published all of their stuff, the peer review process for different things. And then in the wake of it, multiple years, of course, of validating their finds, getting other people to look at that data. Because like I mentioned, they were only given direct access to the cloth for 5 days, but what they spent that 5 days doing was basically gathering everything they possibly could in terms of measurements and the sticky tapes and all that stuff to kind of draw together this massive amount of information to continue to mine for years to come. And so some of the things I've been mentioning, some of the specifics were things that were maybe discovered later. In fact, well, there's several of those things coming up here. And sometimes, like, as best I can, like if I am aware, at least, if I'm aware of a particular data set or particular detail that's a little more speculative, or that's been debunked, or that we're not so sure about that, I do try to point that out. One example is a lot of people hear that they've detected Roman coins, with more like sophisticated, zooming in, on the image of the face, that you can supposedly detect Roman coins. They might be there. There is a good argument for it, but that's a very like debated topic. That's absolutely not been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, as I understand it. So that's a detail I used to have in the slides that I actually learned more about it, and I was like, I'm gonna take that one out.
Sure.
it's cool.
Oh
If
yeah.
it's true, it's, but the whole thing doesn't depend on that detail. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's a good question. I encourage people to be um, skeptical or to be, fair-minded. One of the things I've learned with this whole thing is that it's always such an amazing opportunity to reflect on the nature of faith and reason. One of the
Oh yeah.
reasons I teach on this and bring this up a lot is not so much just this topic itself, but how well this topic I feel like becomes this conduit, or this instrument through which we can discuss the nature of faith and reason working in tandem, not at odds with each other.
Right. No, good point. That is for
Yeah.
sure. So again, folks, we're talking with Mike Creavey on the Shroud of Turin. I will say this real quickly, Mike. I mean, I think this is a good thing to listen to or watch and what with family. So, real quickly,
Yeah.
if you're watching this by yourself, maybe wait until you get back home, or if you're supposed to be working, maybe you should be working. But um, watching it as a family on the TV, that would be, I think, a really good family summer
Yeah.
night thing to do. So I would just throw that out there. Just a good pitch. And then, like I said, it's
Yeah.
the shroud.com, and we'll have Mike's links down below in the show notes as
There's some
well.
others I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'll make sure you have them in time whenever they're watching this, they can see them because I know the British Society for the Turin Shroud. I always get the word orders mixed up. So the BSTS, the British Society for the Turin Shroud, has actually been around since before that STURP team, and some of them were actually involved in helping to fund some of that research, I believe, as well. And they've done so much over the years. Faced a lot of criticism, like in the wake of the carbon dating, they
Oh,
stuck
sure.
with it and they kept going. And
Yeah.
they're a wonderful organization that just recently, in fact, a lot of my guests, are from the UK, and they just recently put out a website that is a great place to start because I think it was Justin Robinson I mentioned earlier. I was told, I think he was the one who pointed out, hey, Shroud.com is wonderful and we want to get people there, but sometimes, like I said, it's just this huge, hub of all these studies and all this data. Sometimes it's hard to navigate, or if you're not really sure where to start. And so this website, I should just bring it up quick so I know what it is. This website is, let me see here. It's it's shroudofturin.uk. So
Okay.
you'll see it below there, but shroudofturin.uk is a great, because it starts off, it kind of gives you a summary of this kind of stuff I'm talking about, and then it will link out to like, hey, you want to learn more about
Really?
the blood stains, you want to learn more about the historical travels as we're about to look at here, and then it'll kind of take you as deep as you want to go. So,
Sure.
but yeah.
Awesome.
So
Thank you for that.
should I now, if I may, I'm going to give a little disclaimer here. I want to say just up front here, and please, I know you are interested in this, especially want to ask anything along the way. This can get down in the weeds pretty quick, and I this is an area that is particularly important to me because of my background in history and some of my guests I've talked to before about this, where I never ever ever want to speak authoritatively about any aspect of this because this is maybe the hardest thing, right? The
Sure.
historical provenance of the shroud. And so that's where I'll try to basically explain here as clearly as I can what I'm going for. So this, notice the question marks,
Right.
right? The question marks. And what we're looking at here is, so if this is Jesus's burial shroud, we know from the Gospels, it has to start in Jerusalem, really in terms of its significance. We don't even know how old the cloth was. Was it a new cloth, an older cloth? But for our purposes, the start point really has to be, right, Easter,
Right.
33 AD, let's say, up to 1578 when it becomes the Shroud of Turin, so to speak, because it's been, as you see on the map here, it's been metropolitan city of Turin. It's been in Turin since 1578. There's no serious historical doubt about that at all. One cool side story, though, is we just found out recently that it was very secretly, I think only like a handful of people even knew this, it was smuggled away from Turin and hidden in a
Really?
monastery during World War II,
Oh,
to
sure.
protect it potentially from the Nazis getting it.
I bet you.
And
I bet
so
you.
that's a
Yeah.
whole other fun story. But then they brought it back and everything. But we absolutely have this chain of custody back to 1578 for sure. Before that, the Savoy family, they were gifted the shroud by a French Crusader origin family in Liray, France, where we have records of this specific cloth, back to 1350s, let's say. And so that's up here, Liray, France. So this stretch, if you want to think of it, this stretch right here, that's very historically documented. There's really no serious doubt about that at all.
Okay.
It's this that's the problem, which, to be fair, it's a huge gap. So I don't want to make light of that. The fact is, we do not have any absolutely for sure historical documentation of this cloth before like 1356. Now, that's not an immediate like, oh, well, it's a fake. Well, you don't know that. That just means like, we don't know from historical documentation for sure that this is the same cloth, but it absolutely could be. And there's different ways to potentially try to connect those dots a little bit. And the question would be, do we have records of other cloths, maybe lost to history, that this could be that we've rediscovered, so to speak, right? So things like that are what you're going to see when you start digging into this. So there's lots of different theories. Many of them, if you kind of average them out, it goes something like this. Starts off in Jerusalem. Over the series of time, it's smuggled away, it's hidden, it's the era where Christians are starting to be persecuted. They don't want this holy relic to get into the wrong hands, kind of thing, right? And it ends up, at the time, this would be modern day Turkey. Then it is eventually taken to Constantinople, modern day Istanbul here, where it spends several hundred years, around the Crusader era. And then in, several different versions of the story go that there is a persecution, or I'm sorry, the horrible event in 1204 when largely French Catholic Crusader knights sack Constantinople, the Eastern Christian city, this horrific event in history. And as part of the looting and the accumulation of Eastern relics that make their way back to Western Europe, that the shroud's one of those. That's the short version of the story.
Okay.
And so there's different theories about that. There was a King Abgar of Edessa right here. This Sanlurfia, the ancient name of it was Edessa. It was a famous city in the sort of Middle East, Syrian city. That this king supposedly wants to be healed. He hears of Jesus and sends word to Jesus to come heal him, but Jesus can't come himself because it's near the events of his crucifixion. But later, this miraculous image of Jesus is sent, and the king is healed. It's a very scarce kind of story where it doesn't say it was a full body image. There's all sorts of arguments about this. One argument is, well, if you look at the shroud carefully, there's clear evidence of different ways it was folded over the centuries. And it looks like for a very long time it was folded so only the face was visible, and the rest of it was in a frame of some kind. Or maybe, depending on how long it was in there, maybe people didn't even know. Sometimes I have frames at home I reuse, and I put a new picture in and I leave the old picture behind it and I forget what's even in there. I'll find it like 10 years later and I'm like, oh yeah. So to me, it's totally like human beings are human beings. Like, so is it feasible? Is it possible, right? That this, and we've all had linen sheets. Linen's a very lightweight cloth. You fold it and there it is, So there's different arguments. One thing I think is cool about that particular argument, this image, this miraculous image of Jesus, the story goes that the king Abgar, his kingdom converted to Christianity, but later subsequent generations apostatized, and to hide it, they hid it in the wall of the city, forgot about it, and then during a repair in the 500s, they supposedly rediscover it, and this image becomes known as the Mandylion. So there's a huge debate out there: is the Mandylion, which is there's other cloths that claim to be the Mandylion, it's just a face of Jesus. It's a whole debated thing. But this argument goes, could the Mandylion actually be the shroud? In fact, and the argument goes, if it is the shroud, this is interesting because notice this, this Mandylion's rediscovered in the 500s. Up until then, earliest depictions of Jesus that we have look something like this. Like he's often depicted in Roman garb, haircut, no beard. From the 500s on, all of it changes, and he looks like this and everything.
Right.
And what's really cool about this, we've seen a lot of these images. The one on the left is maybe the most famous, from the St. Catherine Monastery and Sinai, right? The Pantocrator image. Um, these all look very different, but look at them. Look at what do they have in common, right? He's
The
got
face.
parted hair. The eyes are very distinct, right? Long nose, beard. If you look closely, most of them the mustache comes down on one side a little bit different than the other side. The hair is longer on one side than the other.
That's true.
Or I mean, it's combed a certain way. Like there's all these interesting details, and then what you also see is in the 900s, the Mandylion, we have records of it going to Constantinople. At this time, the Eastern Empires has replaced really Rome and the Western Empire as the place of influence. And this is a depiction of this great event in 944 we have great records of, where they bring this cloth from Edessa, which is now under Muslim control, and they want to preserve it. There's an exchange, I think, that's done with the caliph or someone, and they get this Mandylion comes to Constantinople. It's celebrated, this great event. Here's what's weird about it. Look at the depiction of it. It's a cloth, but there's like a human face coming off, like a real face coming off the cloth.
Right. Yeah.
And the image, I forget the Greek word, arche. Oh man, someone's gonna get on my case now. I don't have it in front of me. There's a Greek word that means like not made with human hands, and this phrase keeps getting used of the image on the Mandylion. It's described as clearly not the work of a human artist. My thought is how would someone 1,000 or 1,500 years ago describe what you see on the Shroud of Turin?
Yeah.
Right? Like someone with no like modern kind of technological notion. Like I don't know how that's made, but it's not made by human hands.
Right.
So anyway, these again, all theory. We're not sure, but this is the argument: is that the cloth ends up in Constantinople. What's neat is around the same time you start seeing images like this on Byzantine coins.
Mm-hmm.
And there's art historians and different experts have done a study on this. There are, I think, dozens of specific points of coincidence between these two images. In other words, when you submit this to sort of a really hyper sophisticated kind of computer modeling here, there are so many exact proportionality matches. Like, yeah, you can look at it with the naked eye and go, yeah, it looks similar. It's more than that. It's like, the length of the nose, the spacing of the eyes, the angles, like all of that, the mathematics of it. My understanding is from, again, those who are much more expert in this than me, the by far most likely explanation for how these two match so much is that whoever minted this coin, the artist that literally minted this coin, which is a very small little fullis, it's only about that big.
Okay.
The best explanation is he was looking at this as he worked on it and designed it and then struck the coin from that. Meaning, if this shroud, what we call the Shroud of Turin, was in the possession of the imperial treasury, and the emperor was like, "Yeah, come on in, take a look for your coin," that's a good argument, for why they match so much. And then you have this. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say not a lot of people know that. I bet about the coin. I didn't.
That's another one of these things. Like that's just in the last few years.
Okay.
A lot of research being done on the art history side of this. Where they go through, I just showed you 4 or 5 pictures. They'll go through dozens and dozens and dozens of icons, like ancient Greek, especially like the sort of the Eastern Catholic and Eastern Christian art, and the history of it, and why does it all look like that all of a sudden? This one is one of my favorites because we know this document. It's a Hungarian document. It's in the National Library, I think, of Hungary in Budapest, called the Prey Codex, named after the monk, I think, who first discovered it, I want to say, in like the 1800s or 1700s. I think it was Gregory Prey, I think. But he discovers this, and it's, liturgical texts and such. But there's this really intriguing artwork here where you see Jesus being prepared for burial, and there's some cool details. Notice this document, we absolutely know this is from somewhere between 1192 and 1195. The reason that's important is that's 200 years before the Shroud of Turin was supposedly hoaxed, right? Yet, here's a depiction of Jesus. What do you notice about his hands? Notice anything in particular? I don't know why the wounds aren't depicted, but look like the actual shape of his hands.
Yeah.
Sorry, what did you say?
No, I was just gonna say I noticed that there wasn't any wounds.
Well, yeah, that's. Yeah. But you also notice there's no thumbs. Like you just see the fingers, no thumbs.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
What's intriguing, we'll see it later on the cloth too. There's no you don't see the thumbs on the shroud. Like his hands are crossed over on the shroud, and I'll show you again when we come to it later. The the reason, after studying the shroud, the medical forensic studies of the shroud have indicated that if you look at where the actual nail wound is for real on his hand, which, in pious religious art from the medieval era, it'd always be through his palm, right? But the shroud actually depicts a wound going in the bottom part of the palm, coming out here, essentially. And and this is, again, family friendly. I had a kid pass out one time when I was talking about this, but I think it's because he was dehydrated. Anyway, but if you actually put a nail, and this, I've got a replica here. You see how massive this is, and if you put this nail through here, it actually it'll sever this nerve in the wrist. That part of in addition to it, on just excruciating pain. That word excruciating means the pain from the cross. That's what the word is. That level of pain, for one thing. But one of the physical effects is that nerve is connected to the thumb, and if it's severed, it starts to retract. And so the thumb, basically, in death, the thumb kind of, it would be kind of retracted up in the palm like that, but you wouldn't see it if the hands are like this.
Sure.
Again, a detail that, like, a French hoaxer, without an incredibly sophisticated, medical forensic knowledge, would never know that, right? Because crucifixion was long gone by medieval France. The Roman Empire wasn't doing it anymore. So we've learned a lot more with archaeology, right, and more recent discoveries about Roman history of how these things were actually done. So that's a really interesting detail. And then the other one is, if you look at the cloth depicts, on the Prey Codex, it depicts these 4 holes, these burn holes in this L pattern that match precisely these burns on the shroud that happened at some point in its long history. Meaning, again, like, what does this prove it? No, but look, how do you explain that? Like, what are the odds, right? That someone just may, I'm going to depict Jesus's burial cloth and I'm just going to randomly put 4 L-shaped holes on it? Like, or is it more likely that he had some awareness of this cloth that people, somewhere were purporting to be Jesus's burial cloth, and it's got holes on it? So I want to depict them on there, So anyway, all these things are so cool. And the long story short is, one form or another, there's arguments that it made it into the Templars' possession, and then they're, of course, suppressed. One of the Templars who's burned at the stake's name is Geoffrey de Charnay. And a few decades later, you have a guy. Now, I'm not sure, there's debate about if they're actually related, but there's another guy also named Geoffrey de Charnay shortly thereafter, who is a well-documented figure, and it's his family, it's his home in Lire, France, where that shroud that we call the Shroud of Turin first shows up for public veneration in the mid-1300s. I think the explanation is their family was involved in the sack of Constantinople, and when the Pope cracked down on the wickedness of what those knights did, you hit it.
Sure.
like the family, because people will say, well, they weren't talking about it in the 1200s. I'm like, I wouldn't either.
No.
Like, if Grandpa killed Christians in Constantinople and stole stuff and hid it in his attic, I don't think you'd talk about it either for a while.
No.
So I think that's people would laugh at me for that. I think that's a perfectly plausible thing, right? And there again, there's Lire, and that's where they, so what we call the Shroud of Turin, the earliest historical records we have of it are in Lire, France, in possession of a Crusader family. So make of that what you will. There's also some theories that actually it wasn't stolen by Crusaders, but that there's a theory that King Louis, Saint Louis, gained possession of it, and then felt guilty for having it and bequeathed it to a friend of his, and that friend of his was, I believe, the father of Geoffrey de Charnay's wife, or his wife's mother, something like that. So Geoffrey de Charnay's wife, or I'm sorry, I think it was his mother. His mother's side, there were friends of his. I think his mother was a close friend of King Louis, Saint Louis, and was one of his biographers or something like that. So there's a connection there too. So there's a few possible ways it can come together to trickle down to this dude, and the rest is history. It's before that we're very skeptical about or not sure about.
Sure. I mean,
so that was a lot. Did you? I know you wanted to. I don't know if you had any questions on that or.
No, that was really good. I was just gonna say it's kind of like, the wheel quash, right? I mean, no one really knew where the real flush was, and no one really had, evidence where the real flush was, and then of course they found it. But again, a lot of people can doubt it, but I think you made a very good point there. I mean, I think that is probably a very good case.
Well, and again, it's open to debate. Let me, if I may, Billy, I just want to show you here quick because I want to get to the really cool stuff here. Make sure we have enough time for it. I'm going to skip over a little bit. I know people are curious about the carbon dating. There's so much out there about that, and not to, again, shameless self-promotion. I've got multiple videos on all kinds of different details on the carbon dating if they want to go into that. Let me just point this out. I don't want to speak ill. I don't want to denigrate anybody. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist or make any, slanderous claims or anything. But this is an interesting quote from Professor Edward Hall. And he was, if you've ever seen this famous picture, they came out and they did the carbon date. They come out and they slap it up on the chalkboard, 1260 to 1390. Like, that's the result. I always like to point out to students, why is there an exclamation mark on there? Like an exclamation mark is not a scientific, if I'm trying to be perfectly objective, I'd like to think that I'd recognize, there's a lot of people, there's a lot at stake here. This is a very sensitive issue, this blah, blah, blah. And I'd come out and I'd write it up and be like, all right, here's what we found and here's what we did and here was our methodology. I just, personally, I don't like, I feel a little like, about the fact that, look, I don't know these guys. I don't know their hearts. They're sons of God. I know at least Professor Hall has passed away. I'm not sure if Robert Hedges is still alive. I think Michael Tite is still alive. I don't want to denigrate them whatsoever, but you look at the fact that the coverage this got, you had to have been absolutely naive to the most extreme level to not know going into this how much media attention this was going to get, because the implications are, if the shroud is fake, what else is fake about Christianity? You know what I mean? I'm not saying that was there. Maybe it was, but the point is, obviously, in our fallen world, that's going to be there, right? And the fact is, I don't know how much these guys were used to the media. I'm sure it's fun to be in the media. It's fun to be in newspapers and TV shows and documentaries, So again, I'm not denigrating them. I'm just recognizing I'm realistic about human nature. And I'm sure there's a temptation there to kind of roll with that. And you look at what Professor Hall said, he's passed away to his eternal reward, God rest his soul. But when someone pushed back and said, okay, you guys have this result, but what about all these phenomenon, all these details, again, we're going to get to in a minute, about the shroud? By the way, are you okay if we go a little over what I originally said?
Yeah, well, I'm fine.
Okay, because I don't want to, I want to, it won't be crazy long, but I do want to get to the good stuff here in a sec. But just this quote from Professor Hall, I think is worth looking at. He says, they basically said, well, what about, the image, this interesting, mysterious image? Because he hadn't talked about that. They just said, it's fake. Well, this is what he said. All of that, like the study, right? The STURP team, decades of people, like very acclaimed, serious scientists studying this, devoting a lot of time to studying this, not just because of some religious fervor, but because it's a really interesting thing. And there's a lot of bizarre, unexplained phenomenon. He just, he brushes it all away and he says, someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up and flogged it. And to me, that's so sad. Like, that's the end of his curiosity, because his lab, and they got a lot of funding for their newer method of carbon dating out of all of this. I don't want to make too much of that, but it's just sad to me that, and then he kind of says somewhat mockingly here, he goes, oh, some people will be upset about it. He got cranky letters, and he basically just wipes all that away and says, if you have any thought, since we did our test, if you have any questions at all about that or any doubts about it, you're a flat earther, essentially. Like, you're on the same level with a flat earther. And so to me, this is just, again, I'm not trying to be cruel to him, but I'm just saying, like, this, I think this is one of those examples we've seen so many times, right, in recent generations, of that kind of hyper-rationalistic, hyper-materialistic attitude that really kind of culminated in a lot of ways with, like, the new atheist movement of the early 20th century and all of that. So that's the world that this was happening in. And you can imagine the folks who were still curious about the shroud, like, it was hard to even get anyone to let you, like, talk about it for a long time. And so I just say for all my friends out there who have done so much research for decades and stuck through all the criticism and the mockery that came out from people, or just the disinterest from people who were like, "Oh, I heard that was fake." God bless you all for sticking with it, because there's a lot of really interesting things to look at. And so
That's for sure.
So that was my little rant, because all I want to point out, like, just to wet people's whistle for this, bottom line, guys, check this out. They were supposed to follow all kinds of very specific criteria for the carbon dating. At the last minute, they basically completely skipped all of the protocols that were agreed upon and picked one piece of cloth from the bottom corner, which was a known repair patch. And there's a lot of cool theories, by the way. There's at least three different theories that I've heard of, with a lot of data behind them to suggest why the dating might have been thrown off. One of the most predominant ones is that basically the patch they tested had repair cloth in it from 1290 to 13. I mean, like, from that range. It was definitely not a representative patch, because this is how the shroud was displayed very often for centuries. Look at how many, throngs of people walking by and touching it. Someone's touching the sacred cloth. They sneeze on it. Who knows? It's just and look at if you see all these bishops or whatever, prelates holding it.
Right.
So, at the outset, dating this thing has all kinds of, variables with it. And that's why they were supposed to take samples from, I think 7 different parts of the cloth. They didn't do that. And they've done infrared. I don't have it here, but there's an infrared you can find online that just shows the shroud and shows you the heat signature, basically, from the fires that survived. And you can clearly see when you look at the infrared, different parts of the cloth have completely different IR signatures. Showing different, effects of scorching and heat and all that. So the bottom line is, there's been a lot on this that's out there. Also suspicious, the British Museum refused to release the raw data from the 1988 carbon dating until they were forced to do so by a Freedom of Information Act release,
Really?
6 or 7 years ago. Yeah, in 2018, a friend of mine, Tristan Casabianca, I got an interview with him. He's a French attorney, did a lot, and they published their findings, I think, in Archaeometry. Basically, they got access to the raw data, and the raw data, there's some problems. One thing that they did basically during the test was they moved the goalposts. Basically, they essentially changed the margin of error on some of the stuff they did with their testing. So again, I'm not an expert on any of that, but I'll put it this way: I don't know any serious skeptic of the shroud. There's plenty of skeptics today, people who have issues with the shroud. They don't think it's authentic. Fair enough. Okay, they got their arguments. I don't know any of them who point to the carbon dating anymore to make their case. It's very rare for me to get a very serious kind of scientist to come back and be like, no, because the carbon dating says this. They usually make other arguments now, because there's, if nothing else, and some people go into conspiracy theories. I don't know, maybe there was a conspiracy. That's not my field. All I know is it's pretty well established now that if nothing else, you really can't rely on the carbon dating. So that's, and I'll have one little detail on that later that's cool.
Okay,
but
that's
do we
good
have
to know. Yeah.
So do we have it? I don't know, like 10, 15 minutes, or is that too much?
Okay.
Or can I? Because I think I can. Because here's the cool stuff. I'll just give it to you straight. We can come back any of it you want to talk about.
We
Part
got 15
1,
minutes.
2. Yeah. So part 1, 2, and 3. Basically, what I really get to here that I love to look at from all these conversations and things I've gathered over the years. What really, to me, is some of the coolest stuff. And there's so much more, but this is just one slide for each. So 3 slides here. The cloth, the blood on the cloth, and then the image of the man. 3 different things. First of all, data that they've discovered on the cloth itself. There's pollen on it, which, is not surprising. There's pollen on everything. We're doing this in spring. There's pollen on my dashboard, or the hood of my car, rather. Not my dashboard, but maybe if it gets pollinated. The specific kind of pollen from this plant, this Gundelia tourneforti, which, some plants grow around the world, some don't. This is a specific plant that only blossoms within 5 to 20 kilometers of Jerusalem and only around Passover. And it's on the shroud. And it's basically something, the oldest pollen that they discovered on the shroud is Jerusalem pollen, basically. It's like,
That's
okay, so your medieval hoaxer from France was like, oh, got to make sure we get pollen on it, so when they detect it hundreds of years from now in the future, it's authentic. Like what?
yeah.
Like, I
That
mean,
makes sense.
people knew about pollen, right? 700 years ago. They didn't know you could detect where it was from. We didn't
Right.
discover that till much more recently, right? So that's cool. Also, the weave, the actual weave of the linen, matches more recent findings we found from like the siege of Masada, the famous siege of Masada during the Jewish War, a couple decades after Jesus's time. But the point of that is the style of the cloth itself is consistent with other cloths we found, from that time. So there's no mismatch there. There's soil samples they found, especially around like the nose, the knees, the feet. In other words, where this man was walking, where he, I don't know, fell while carrying his cross, which he was carrying a cross, by the way. It's got this metal element. It's element number 38, strontium, calcium carbonate with strontium in it, and it has its own unique crystalline structure, which one geologist, especially that was studying this in depth, said his words. He said it matches Jerusalem travertine aragonite limestone like a fingerprint. In other words, the consistency of the specific dirt signature.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, oh, hey guys, I'm making a fake shroud to depict Jesus for people to just come and pay money to see, but I really want to make sure the dirt match. Like, what?
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense. This is cool too. So this is a whole other topic, but there's, long story short, in the Gospels, there's a face cloth too that Jesus is buried with. But they take it off, or when you say they go in the tomb, there's the cloths, plural. This is the shroud, and then there's this face cloth off to the side. The argument goes that, well, first of all, this cloth, Sudarium, it's called the Sudarium Christi, is in Spain. It's been in Spain since the at least 5th century. So this is another purported relic of Jesus that was a separate cloth that was taken and hidden. This one went to Spain eventually, and it's been venerated there. And we have very good historical records on this, going back to, the 400s AD. There are similar pollen grains on it. The wounds match exactly. So if you examine the face and the head area of these cloths, they've shown pretty specifically here that there's 70 wounds on the front and 50 on the back that match so perfectly that the best explanation for it is that these two were on the same head.
Wow.
And then, so just looking at that, you've got these two claws, like you're trying to do a murder investigation. You got two claws that match exactly. And one of the cloths is, at least 1,600 years old, but a lot of people say this one's only 1,000 or 800. You're like, wait a minute, something's wrong with that. And what's really cool that people don't realize is it's not just blood. Blood's what you see, but there's other fluids on the cloths, right? There's nasal fluid, there's pleural fluid, there's saliva. The pleural fluid is the sac around like the lung, basically, that helps keep your lungs from kind of like scraping, inside you. It helps to kind of keep them, what's the word I'm looking for? Like lubricated, basically, within your rib cage and stuff. When that man stabs Jesus in the gospel, the Roman guard stabs him, from the wound characteristics on the shroud, it looks like that lance, they say, goes up into, it punctures, I think, part of his heart, and it punctures the lung. And they said, consistent with the wounds that this man has incurred on the shroud, you would expect to have fluid build up in the lungs so that when he's stabbed, there would be blood and what looks like water flowing out of that wound because of the pleural fluid, which we can see under UV light on the shroud and on the Sudarium.
Okay. Wow.
But not with the naked eye, right? So so all these things are just so amazing. And this is, lastly, the really cool thing is there's no image on the face cloth. Why is that? Well, keep that tucked away for a second. Remember, if the face cloth is taken off and then he's just buried in the shroud, that might explain it in a second.
That's true.
Can I jump over to the blood real quick? I'm going to go a little quicker with this. This you can just see. Here's the linen, like just like a microscopic view of just the linen where it's unobstructed. You can see the weave there. Okay. Here's where the image is present. You see that very faint, almost caramel color, where we're talking about individual fibers of linen that are discolored. And you guys, you've had linen sheets before, right? I mean, it's like a fiber of linen. Like, how thin is linen when it's all together? I mean, if you tap a linen pillowcase, right, or a sheet, you tap it with a Sharpie, it's going to bleed right through it from that capillary effect, right? The image of the man on the shroud only penetrates the cloth about the width of a human hair.
Really?
In individual fibers. Like, you flip the cloth over, all the blood stains, the burn holes, that's all there. There's no image of a man on the back of the shroud. Like, how is that even possible, right? And here's where you can see the blood stains, like, they're very distinct. But you can see right there that the blood and then whatever that image is, they're different phenomena. So in other words, the blood stains are not what's producing that image of the man. The blood they've studied, it's AB blood, which interestingly enough matches multiple purported Eucharistic miracles that have been tested where you get an AB blood. AB blood is the rarest on earth. It's most predominant among Middle Eastern men. So there you go again. Our French hoaxer, first of all, he's going to use chicken blood, right? Or goat blood. He's not going to, blood is blood. They don't even know that human blood is different than goat blood, yet. And we don't even know about blood types until what, like 100, 120 years ago, I think? So how is, what? It doesn't make any sense. It's 372 different blood stains. And again, it's real human blood, serum albumin, hemoglobin. There's also this enzyme in the blood. I'll jump down here. There's so much I don't have time to get to. I'm unloading, if that's okay.
That's fine.
The blood stains have this this thing called bilirubin in it. It's a pigment basically that happens where when you're subjected to extreme trauma, the blood retains more of its reddish color. Because, like you ever take a Band-Aid off like that night or the next day and it's like brown or black, the blood stains on the shroud are still pretty red, like potentially thousands of years later. How's that possible? Well, they study it's got this blood in it, meaning even if you just, you pricked your finger and put some blood on it, no, the blood wouldn't have those characteristics. It's the blood of someone who has been tortured, and has subjected to extreme polytrauma. And then lastly, I'll just jump over so we don't run out of time here. Thank you all for sticking around. This is cool stuff. Like I said, there's so much more, but the most interesting of all is that image, and just to lay it out here, it's a precise, anatomically perfectly correct, high resolution, 3-dimensional photographic negative. Right. So the image like when you look at the Shroud of Turin, the image of the man you see is a photographic negative. And when you make it a negative, you see the positive image of the man that produced the image. And in modern times now, we are also able to, and now we're getting some AI assist on this too. The image has 3-dimensional information in it. So this was from 2003. They started discovering, when you do 3D image enhancement, that's additional level of detail of what's going on in that,
Sure.
Well, what? Remember I said, so I already mentioned that the image is just on that superficial level of the cloth. Here's a really cool thing, though. All of the blood, and we know this for a fact, the image happened after all of the blood ends up on the cloth, meaning he's dead and he's buried. It's death. There's some blood that we can tell because, there's a difference, between sort of, pre-death blood and post it, like the blood that's still flowing a little bit, but as you've died, they can detect all of that. So he was dead when he's buried. The body's going into rigor mortis. And then the image is produced somewhere between 36 and 40 hours after he died. Now you do the math on that. If it's Jesus, he dies around 3 p.m. on a Friday, right? 24 hours later, 3 p.m. Saturday. 36 hours is, early a.m. Sunday morning. Hello? Yeah, I mean, it's just unbelievable. This stuff is just so cool. And here's what's really neat. Here's what they figured out. As best modern science can figure out, after they've studied the shroud over and over again, the most likely cause is some sort of background ultraviolet burst of radiation. Okay, like a radiological event. In other words, the STURP team came back and subsequent research, they said, look, it is not paint. There's people out there saying, oh, they proved it's paint. No, they didn't. That's nonsense. There's lots of... I'll send you some articles if you want. It's not paint, it's not dye, it's not scorching. It's, you know, like a bas relief, like they heat up a 3D metal body and drape it. Nope, it's not that. Just exhausting every possible method of human artwork. It's nothing like that. A lab most recently in Italy, under the director of Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro, I'll just jump ahead here. They were able to use these hyper sophisticated ultraviolet lasers, basically, to simulate this sort of massive radiation. And they were able to create, now nothing near the level and the crispness of the image of the whole shroud as it is, but they were able to create an image that had similar characteristics, where it was just on the level of it, coloring was similar, it was 3D information in it, all that. Their hypothesis then, or what they sort of kind of projected out of that, you know, they basically said that to create the image that exists on the Shroud of Turin using their method would require more ultraviolet light than exists on the planet.
Wow.
You know,
that's great. Yeah.
With these massively powerful pulses that also are very short, because if you have it's billions of watts, you know, and if you have like the corresponding heat that would normally, you know, in theory be with that, you'd know, you know, it'd just be vaporized or whatever. Somebody said, I forget, they equated it to something like several 100,000 searchlights all aimed at one spot, you know, or the level of like light intensity you'd be experiencing if you were like 10 or 12,000 miles off the surface of the sun. Like, it's just astonishing. And it makes me think of what Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Yeah, you're kidding. And so, and then last but not least, I love this more recently from Father Robert Spitzer, who was talking about this. He's done a lot on the Shroud as well. He's got a lot of great stuff over at the Magis Center. He describes it as, and this gets into it, my friend Bob Rucker has a lot of research postulating that the dating was thrown off because of a neutron flux, which corresponds with this a little bit. And I'm not a physicist, but my understanding is that you have, with this nuclear reaction, produces this flux of protons and neutrons. You got the, you know, the positively charged neutrons, the neutrally charged, the positively charged protons, the neutral neutrons. The protons, I think the argument is that the protons, if I remember correctly, you know, kind of bounce back, or they produce the image, but the neutrons pass through the cloth. I might have that backwards. If I'm wrong, Bob, I'm so sorry, but I'm not the physicist. But here's what's interesting. He talks about, obviously, like, that happening at all out of a dead body doesn't make any sense. But here's an interesting thing. Father points out that linen has lots of this nitrogen isotope in it. Okay? The reason that's interesting is apparently N14, the nitrogen isotope, when you add a proton to N14, it creates new carbon-14.
Really?
Meaning that if this theory is correct, one of these sort of, you could think of it this way, the resurrection is supernatural. There is no natural explanation for it. I want to be clear about that. But God very frequently, right, grace builds on nature. God frequently he loves nature. He made nature. The question is, are there natural effects and consequences in correspondence with the supernatural event of the resurrection, that he left us these breadcrumbs 20 centuries before we could study them to dig in now? I mean, that seems like something God would do, or our hyper doubtful rationalistic era, right? But the point being, this is yet another explanation. Like, even if the patch that was tested was totally fine, it still might have thrown it off, because there might be an unexpected amount of carbon on it, right? Which would throw a carbon dating off, because C14 is exactly what carbon dating is looking for, right? It's like the precise isotope, whatever that's being tested for, or the decay of it, right? The natural decay of it that's being tested for in a carbon dating. It's exactly what would be thrown off potentially by this, if this is the explanation for it.
Sure.
So, long story short, I wrap up here. We went over, but this is, I like to always bring my students back to this question, right? You know, we got convergence of evidence has to do with multiple sources, right? So like chemistry, physics, history, like you have all that. And then preponderance of evidence, where's that needle? Like what's more likely than not? Is it more likely that the shroud and the Sidarium were on two different bodies, yet somehow have more, like way, way, way more points of coincidence than are required to convict someone in a murder trial, just by chance? Or that they were on the same body and something's wrong with the carbon dating? Like, what's more likely? So these, like, to always, whatever you're looking at, like, be willing to be wrong. Like, I might be wrong. I've always listened to different theories and stuff.
Sure.
But then, look, because this is important, for me, like I said, the Shroud is so great, so important. But the deeper question of here is, I mean, what is certitude? Like, I got to be certain. If I had to be certain that my wife would, never push me down the stairs for like the money, which is silly because there's nothing to inherit really. But if I had to be certain that she would never do that before I married her, I wouldn't be married. Like, how do you, like, oh, she'll never do, I don't know that she won't do that. Maybe she'll do it by mistake. So that's a terrible example, but like, these are the things I bring up with people, like, somewhere in there, you have to have some faith. And that's not the same as just being credulous, And so I leave it with Thomas Aquinas here. I love, like, I'll just kind of end here. He says, to one who has faith, no explanation's necessary. To one without faith, no explanation's possible. Well, I'm convinced there's some folks showing up on my YouTube channel when I put these videos out where no matter what, the Shroud can't be real. And so they won't even, like, they'll find all kinds of ways to just dismiss it, where I'm like, well, look, could it be a big giant hoax? Yeah, you have to take my word for it. I genuinely believe that if that were really proven to me, and I could possibly really understand that, I would go, oh, well, that's a shame. I was really convinced. Wow, okay. It wouldn't make me lose my faith. But I encourage, our friends out there watching this who might be tempted to be like, it can't be real because of because those guys in Oxford or those guys at the Zurich lab or wherever, they wouldn't have made mistakes, or they're above, suspicion, or they're above human, frailty or sin. Well, be careful with that.
Oh, yeah.
So,
all human.
Yeah. So that's, let me, oh, sorry, but just truly last thing. And this is, people can get these links from me later. I show, like, there's these artistic depictions of the crucifixion, some more accurate than others. Now we're in this age with, like, AI and being able to really glean all this data off the image of the man on the shroud to a tremendously, increasingly sophisticated level that they're able to create more and more sophisticated representations of him. The most recent one I found was this from, I hope it's okay for me to use this, from Doug Powell, who used Midjourney to kind of pull in a lot of, like, Shroud pictures and stuff. So this is the most recent sort of AI assisted, like, what Jesus may have looked like based off the Shroud. So I thought I'd end with that.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
But yeah. So as always, I just, if anyone wants to learn more, they can just, hit me up on my website or any of the YouTube videos. We got a lot more coming out. I'm going to post this as well, because our friends who, may know more about my channel through the Shroud stuff, but not yours as much. I want to give you a boost, hopefully a little too, maybe get you on their radar, and you can see if you can have some of them on, because they're wonderful, wonderful guests, and they're all wonderful to talk to. So yeah, but thanks for having me on. I go on and on about this, so thanks everybody for your patience.
No, I appreciate you, Mike, and wanting to come on. And yeah, I mean, without guests like you, the show wouldn't be possible. So, and like I said, this is a big deal for a lot of people. So, even though you might not call yourself an expert, but you really thought some really good key points that, again, I didn't know about. I think a lot of people don't look at it too closely.
Well, I knew like 2%, like everything I just went over with you guys. I knew like 2 or 3% of that, like 3 or 4 years ago. So it's just really, like, there's so much to learn.
But there is. That's why you always learn something new every day, right? Or
yeah, amen.
Yeah. So all right, Mike Creavey, thanks again for coming on. Find out his links down below, and we'll hopefully have you back on again real soon, Mike.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Until next time, everyone, God bless, go to the sacraments, stay in grace, and we see you next time on Catholic Table Talk.